scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when Peppa and George decided to play hide and seek in their house. The storm outside made everything darker than usual, and the wind howled through the trees in their garden. Mummy Pig was busy in the kitchen, and Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in the living room, just like any other day. Peppa counted to 10 while George ran off to find the perfect hiding spot. When she opened her eyes and began searching, she noticed something strange. Every room she entered seemed slightly different from how she remembered it. The pictures on the walls showed faces she didn't recognize, and the furniture was arranged in ways that felt wrong. She called out for George, but her voice echoed strangely through the house, as if the walls were much further away than they should be. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly in both directions. New doors appeared where there had never been doors before, leading to rooms that shouldn't exist. Behind one of these mysterious doors, Peppa found a room filled with toys that looked exactly like hers, but they were all wrong somehow. Her favorite teddy bear sat in the corner, but its button eyes had been replaced with real eyes that blinked and followed her movements. The dollhouse in the center of the room was an exact replica of their house, but tiny figures inside were moving on their own. As Peppa watched in fascination and growing fear, she realized that the tiny figures in the dollhouse were her family. Tiny Mummy Pig was cooking in the miniature kitchen, Tiny Daddy Pig was reading his tiny newspaper, and there was even a tiny version of herself, searching through the tiny rooms just as she was doing in the real house. The tiny Peppa in the dollhouse looked up and waved at her. When the real Peppa waved back, she noticed that her reflection in the dollhouse window was waving too, but a few seconds too late. The tiny Peppa's mouth moved as if she was trying to say something important, but no sound came out. Suddenly, Peppa heard George crying from somewhere deep in the house. She ran toward the sound, but every door she opened led to another identical room filled with the same wrong toys and the same dollhouse. Each dollhouse contained the same scene, but the tiny figures were in slightly different positions, as if time was moving differently in each one. The crying grew louder and more desperate. Peppa realized that the sound wasn't coming from the real George, but from one of the tiny George in one of the dollhouses. She leaned closer to listen and saw that all the tiny figures in all the dollhouses had stopped what they were doing and were now staring directly at her. Their tiny faces had changed. Where there should have been simple, happy expressions, there were now looks of terror and desperation. The tiny Mummy Pig was pointing frantically at something behind the real Peppa. The tiny Daddy Pig was shaking his head violently, as if trying to warn her about something. When Peppa turned around, she saw that the room had filled with dozens of other children, all looking exactly like her friends from playgroup, but their eyes were completely white and they moved in perfect synchronization. They all raised their hands at the same time, pointed at her at the same time, and opened their mouths at the same time. Instead of words, a sound like rushing wind came from their mouths, growing louder and louder until it drowned out George's crying. The dollhouses began to shake and rattle on their tables, and the tiny figures inside were running around frantically, trying to escape from their miniature prison. Peppa tried to run, but found that her legs wouldn't move. She looked down and saw that her feet had become part of the floor, as if she was slowly sinking into the house itself. The white-eyed children began walking toward her in their synchronized way, their footsteps making no sound on the carpet. As they got closer, Peppa could see that they weren't really her friends at all. They were something else wearing the shapes of her friends, something that had been waiting in the house for a very long time. The dollhouses continued to shake more violently, and she could hear the tiny voices of her family calling her name from inside their miniature world. The last thing Peppa saw before everything went dark was one of the dollhouses falling to the floor and breaking open. The tiny figures of her family spilled out and began running toward her, but they were no bigger than her thumb, and the white-eyed children were stepping on them as they advanced, crushing the tiny voices one by one until there was only silence.